If you had to capture how you feel about the current state of retail in one word, what would that be?
Panic.
My name is Yaniv and Carl. I'm here to study successful innovation professionals and uncover the mindset and models they use to de-risk the future. On this podcast, I invite fellow professors, practitioners, and entrepreneurs to have an honest conversation about the business of innovation. No more bullshit. We talk openly and honestly about what works and what doesn't. So come on, get your ass in that seat. School's about to start. Hey, Carl. Welcome to the School of Innovation.
It's always good to be back in school, Yaniv.
I want to get right into it and kind of warm up with this question. It might be challenging, but let's see how it goes. Are you up for it?
I'm always up for a challenge, Yaniv, especially coming from you. I know it's going to be a good one. That's why I'm here.
Okay. Now I'm a little worried because maybe I've set expectations a little bit too high, but let's give it a try. So here's my question: if you had to capture how you feel about the current state of retail in one word, what would that be?
Panic.
Okay, good one. All right, now explain why panic.
Well, listen, I mean, it's a complicated answer, as you know. There's a lot of factors that they're creating the panic, but it's just I think we're in the unforeseen, right? As much as people like to say, no, this isn't a black swan event, it's something that we knew was coming. We should have been better prepared for it. The reality is 80% of our existence in retail is based on the ability for people to want to purchase something, have easy access to it, and and that 80% I'm referring to is obviously physical retail. And yes, we were all, uh, you know, finding our way towards some more digital formats, but the reality was is we were still very very dependent on physical distribution in from stores. And when that all gets shut down, or the vast majority of it, especially anything that's remotely non essential, gets shut down, then it creates panic. I mean, it sets off waves, economic waves, that just are, I won't say irreparable, but it's going to be tough because we're not done yet. I think to use the baseball analogy from these parts. It's hopefully out of the first inning, but I think we still have many innings to go.
But I think the fact that you said panic, that's kind of surprising to me because it in some way it's a bit hopeful. I think because I was thinking you were going to say like fucked, screwed, like a lot more, I guess, terminal words.
I'm an optimist, Yaniv. Yeah, I'm an optimist. Panic,
But
panic probably is the step just before fucked and screwed. I guess is what panic is.
but it's not there
But
yet.
no, I mean,
It's not there yet.
no. So here's the thing, and even this is maybe a cultural reference, and I don't know how it translates, into different parts sometimes. But why the word panic is especially important in this moment is retailers have historically been nothing but panicked. They've always been very cool. I mean, their business could be sinking like the Titanic, and you'd be asking them as they're playing the violin in the bar room of the Titanic, how's it going? And they'd be like, yeah, it's not bad. Everything's okay. We'll be fine. That's always been sort of the resilience of the retail sector. And it still is in a lot of cases, but there is a sense, you're feeling it more and more that some retail leaders are I won't say, I think panicked is maybe a strong word, especially for the ones that represent shareholders and have to show that they have some notion of control. But the reality is there's this high level of uncertainty because let's face it, much of retail right now is so dependent on government's goodwill to support them, and banks and whatever institutions you want to think of. So it's not a good position to be in.
Do you think we're going to see something like the 2008 crisis where the government swoops in and saves retail, like they saved the banks?
See, saving the banks was pretty easy in this, when you look at it in terms of scale, because they didn't have to spread it so wide. So they're already trying. I mean, they're putting a lot of stop gaps in place and trying to, any measure that puts money into a consumer's hand right now is in some ways saving retail, right? It's still giving them some spending, hopefully discretionary income. But for how long is that going to last? And obviously, it depends what part of the world you're in, to what level. I'm in Canada, so we're pretty fortunate that we have a government that's doing its utmost. Which who knows for how many decades we'll be paying for that? But at least a short term, it's creating some measures of relief, but that's not getting spread evenly. That the it's not all the retailers that are benefiting from that. So is it the same? I mean, I think everybody's trying. I mean, it's way broader, because again, the financial collapse, the Lehman Brothers story is one that was pretty containable. The retail one, the containment is just so much further reaching in terms of commercial real estate, supply chain, logistics, that support the supply chain, the fact that it's often in most parts of the world, if not the top employer in the top three. So, and the Lehman Brothers, the Great Recession analogy is interesting, because I've been talking, last, I guess I'm going on 3 months now, but what I've called coined the Great Acceleration, in the context of having had here in North America the Great Depression that provokes so much change, and then 2008, the Great Recession that you just referred to, and I'm seeing this one as the Great Acceleration, for the reason that everything we're witnessing right now, these collapses and whatnot, are all things that were sort of going to come, but in a much more measured and drawn out way. So these store closures, these realignments of supply chain, some refocus on digital capabilities. These were all in the works, but they were going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, not in the next 3 to 5 months. So that's why I'm thinking, as we're going to look back on this crisis, we're going to see that this was maybe we're going to think of it as the Great Acceleration or the Great Accelerator, and that's why I do the term panic, as you put it, is maybe hopeful, because it just sort of provokes changes that needed to happen, and a crisis is obviously the biggest catalyst of change.
In that regards, what how would you pave the way out? Like, how would you say or recommend that they you know
So my template right now, the playbook that I'm looking to push forward, and I'm developing as everybody as we're going along. But I've become really fascinated by the notion of resilience. What builds resilience in an organization, and maybe just because I'm from my nature and my background, I try to work a lot on balance, and maybe it's my bilingual heritage of being brought up in two languages at the same time, and trying to always find sort of that equilibrium. But it's I think we're I as part of this great acceleration, I think we're headed towards that 50-50 blur, where physical and digital sort of intersect, and that half our business is done through predominantly digital channels, and half of it will be done through predominantly physical, but there will be a lot of overlap, as you won't be able to discern sort of, they'll intertwine, the two worlds will intertwine more and more. And for me, that's how you build resilience. I don't think you want to be 100% dependent on digital either. Like, there could be catastrophes around that could happen as well. And so to know that your muscle, your left arm and your right arm are equally strong, I think is sort of the way you want to be working out right now, and making sure, or that your upper and lower body have equal strength, so that when one's called upon more than the other, that you feel comfortable to be able to work through it. So right now, obviously, our digital body in much of retail wasn't worked out enough. And it's not just on the retailer, by the way. I mean, the retailer is dependent on a bunch of other partners in the ecosystem to do that too, from payment to to the delivery. So there's a lot of players that have to up their game as well too, not just the retailers. But because it's not just an e-commerce thing. It's not like, well, we're not our e-commerce wasn't strong enough. Our platform wasn't strong enough. No, what the challenges usually are happening in the warehouse, and are happening in with the delivery trucks, as much as they're happening anywhere else. So this resilience, that's for me, the playbook is head as quickly as you can to a business model where you're planning on doing half of your business online and half of your business. And you know how it's going to play out. It might be 60-40, it might be 65-35. But I think if you aim sort of just ideologically for that 50-50, I think you're in a better position, and more, your organization is going to be more resilient because of it.
In the context of innovation labs, because that's how we met. We met around, I was working at Explorium in Shanghai, which is the Fun Group's retail innovation lab. And you are now an advisor, right, to a retail lab at McGill University in Canada. So what's interesting that's happening at the lab at McGill, like in that context?
Well, unfortunately, not much is happening in terms of open, and because of this crisis. We were hoping to be open in May, and now the timelines keep getting corrected for simple reasons like just travel bans that have made it hard for some of the equipment we need and the people we need to get here. So we have contingencies for that right now. And honestly, the campus is closed, so we don't even really technically have access to the buildings. So they're all campus. But okay, let's go. The premise will be, it'll be a gym for probably one major retail partner that and a bunch of technology partners. And obviously the whole ecosystem will see how that manifests. So there will be repercussions for those immediate partners, and obviously the academics. They're going to want to publish their findings around this. And this, the first iteration, which will be, and when you're working in academic horizons, it's not the same cycles as what you would have gone through at Explorium. So it's 2 to 3 year cycles, just because that tends to be the cycle to publish as well. Which coming out of this crisis will be interesting to see if that's still the case, because that's everything, time is compressing. But anyway, it's a long term commitment, and between the partners, and we will be working with a convenience, in a convenience format. So exploring sort of what the future of convenience can look like, and then all the sort of all the analytics that can go along with that, and the technologies and the experimentation. So much more inspired by concepts like This Is Story, or even your Explorium, inspired me a lot into short iterative cycles, which some of the experiments could play that way for sure. But I mean, the overall um, dynamic of the space will be longer horizon that will allow the academics to get the volume of of data or behaviors or whatever that they're going to need to truly conduct proper world class research.
Right. Right. So let's, I want to explore that a little bit further, um, because I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've done a lot of research on innovation labs. You've visited a lot of innovation labs across the world. I am curious about, what you saw, what you learned.
Yeah, so I mean, it's well, I think the first thing I learned is that it's a lot harder than it seems, especially to try to bring together various stakeholders. And now in an era of where we're rightfully putting a lot of attention on things like data privacy and how it's managed, the stakeholders that becomes now probably the much more uh, complex part of the equation, which is originally it was more around the complexity was around the experience. How can I create an actually a conducive, enjoyable experience for a space that sort of doesn't look like a hodgepodge of different technologies that are just trying to look cool. Like there's actually some sort of continuity as to how they're being applied. But that was the initial big challenge, and often, the term gets used all the time, innovation theater. I mean, often it was just more PR than anything, right? It was especially the ones that were specific to one organization. There's exceptions. I mean, there's some very good ones. Microsoft, for instance, has an excellent one where they really have a large picture of what's going on. Intel has some as well, and obviously Explorium. I think the first iteration, anyways, of Explorium was really interesting that way. The large horizon stuff, but when it's a a vendor that's sort of focused on EPOS for, and I'm tossing that one out. I don't even have a brand in mind, but I'm just using that sort of as a, and so the whole experience is centered around EPOS. I mean, it loses its novelty pretty quickly, right? So how do you maintain engagement? But like I said, right now the challenges beyond that is all around data sharing and data privacy. That's probably the biggest challenge. As we've become pretty good, I think, at designing experiences. The best labs, and I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but I personally believe the best labs are the ones that you don't know are labs. Like, I think that those for me are the ones that are the most interesting, because they tend to, I prefer technology that's in the back, running in the background, that's optimizing, making things better, smoother, without me even knowing it's doing that. And that's sort of my vision of a lab as well. Sure, you want to have some cool stuff. You do want to have, there's some bells and whistles for you and I and the people that are, really geek out on this stuff. But for 99% of the other people, they just want a smooth transaction, a personalized experience, a relevant experience. They don't, knowing that it's running on seamless RFID powered by predictive analytics doesn't really matter much to them. But to, you and I would obviously get pretty excited by those notions. But it's not meant. That's not what the lab is there for. The lab there is supposed to be an environment where you interact with customers in a setting that's representative of reality, and that's I think are the most effective labs. And we're starting to see some, that are coming around, but the business model is still a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Now I'm kind of assuming that, if there are any retailers listening to this episode, they're like, uh, what are you talking about? Like,
I get that a
thinking
lot,
about
Yaniv. I
it's
get
like,
that a
yeah,
lot.
right. It's like at this point, what are you even talking about innovation labs? Like they can see 5 meters or feet or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah, yeah,
in front of them. But like, can we think about, and you're absolutely right. Innovation labs are complicated. They're messy. You need to have the vision and the strategy right, and also pretty expensive. They're
yeah. The
pretty
resources.
damn
I was gonna say,
expensive.
before maybe even vision and strategy, you almost need to know the resources are there, the financial and.
Yeah. So can we? So do you have any ideas about how to make a cheap version, cheap yet effective, but not cheap, but let's say, right,
Affordable.
effective or affordable? Yes, inexpensive lab that gets at the heart of what the lab is supposed to be, but without, like, all the overhead.
Yeah. So two things. Maybe before I even get into that, I'll say what's different about this, been different so far about this crisis than the other ones we've seen. Obviously, this is at a whole other magnitude, but is that often in the past, the first places to get cut were the innovation groups. That's not to say that they're not being pulled back. I mean, at the beginning they weren't, because there was most of the reactions for the first month or two were all about, okay, we got to roll out digital, 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 and who usually was at the core of that were the people running the innovation agenda. So they weren't going to axe those people right away. Although now, unfortunately, I'm starting to see some, the ones that were less committed, much less committed to it, I think, in the first place, now they've gotten around to really downsizing their innovation groups, unfortunately, and I think that's still a mistake. But now the good news is that the majority, or especially the larger organizations, are actually in some cases doubling down on their innovation groups, and looking at, how can we, knowing that this sort of better prepared them for what they're going through right now, and how they want to make sure they keep that pace, and even use this as an opportunity to increase the pace, actually. So that's sort of before, yeah, that sort of that lays the groundwork. Now, in terms of doing it cost effectively, I think, and this comes back to my previous point of using actual, locations that don't seem like labs, meaning an actual operational store, for instance, and making them so that they're not just cost centers. So they're maybe not profitable, because there's investments in those spaces that are above and beyond what a regular space would be for that retailer, let's say, or that brand. But that they're, at least it's still a revenue generator. It's not just a pure sort of dark lab that's eating money away while we're pretending to run focus groups through it, who aren't actually buying anything. So And at McGill, our lab is going to be, that was one of this is an organization that's, pretty practical or pragmatic when it comes to stuff like, hey, no, we still want to make, we're not saying this needs to be necessarily a profitable endeavor, but we don't want it to be a pure money loss either. Like we need to find some sort of balance. So I think that it works well in that context, and I've come around to that because originally that's I thought no, a pure innovation space needs to be a sandbox that doesn't have the shackles of reality sort of tied to it. It needs to go untethered and do into whatever space mind space it needs to generate. You can't really create innovation without it. I've come around a bit to thinking more about in more pragmatic terms around how can you innovate in circumstances that are more, quite honestly, realistic. I mean, I think that was sort of the challenge for our first generation of labs was they weren't very realistic. Economically, we did a lot of cool shit in them. I mean, don't get me wrong, and stuff that was, most of it was ahead of its time, and now is going to come in, 5 years later is going to start making a lot of sense. But I think of my friend Kyle Nell. I don't know if you ever met Kyle, but Kyle was running the innovation group for Lowe's. I mean, he was doing some of the wackiest stuff, man. But it's it was 3D printing tools and doing a VR full VR experiments of how to lay tile using VR, and that sort of stuff. I mean, 5 years ago, in the Hall room or whatever. Now he's moved on. He's running Singularity now, or running courses at Singularity. But he's all that stuff now is going to be like, okay, yeah, it makes sense now. But unfortunately, and that's what originally an innovation group was meant to be. But I think we leapt a little too much into the future sometimes, and we needed to be a little more grounded. And some business leaders came around and said, this actually has to ROI. We still need to think about different horizons, but we need to have at least some things we're doing that are going to ROI in a shorter term. And the best place to do that is in an actual transactional space. I think that's the key. And maybe I'm coming ahead to another question of yours. But one of the key ingredients that I learned from that is that, okay, well, how do you choose that location? That you're going to test in. And a friend of mine who runs innovation, another large retail group here, was telling me, because I said, how do you? He mentioned that they had several thousand stores. And he says there's 20 stores that we basically run our testing in. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. How did you choose the 20? Is it like demographics? Is it geographically representative? Sample sizes? All the sort of scientific reflexes we have. He's like, no. He goes, if we have it, we need a manager of that store that's open to this, and that's our first criteria. It's
Exactly.
having people that don't feel threatened by it are actually excited about it and want to support it and go, yay! You're choosing my store to try this new cool thing out. I'd love it. That's number one
Perfect.
criteria for running an experiment in a store. I was like, you know what? That makes perfect sense.
That's so true. That's so true. Now, I think you said something very interesting about like how do you like stuff that happens in the lab and how you take it out of the lab, because that's the same shit that we had at the media lab, where you had all these smart people developing
Oh
all
man,
this
yeah, that's a
cool
whole
stuff.
other level, though. I mean,
But
but you're talking about the MIT lab, right?
yeah, yeah, but I mean, it happens like in any lab, right? Shit needs to get out of the lab. If it doesn't get out of the lab, it's worthless. It's like it didn't ever exist. So I think a lot of these labs that I saw, that I'm seeing, they don't pay enough attention to how stuff leaves the lab. So, like, have you thought about that? Have you like seen some like ways that people do that?
I listen. I'm sounding like a broken record now, but I think it kind of again comes back to, if you're doing it in an environment that's pretty much representative of an actual, as representative as you can get of an actual store, and it seems to be improving the metrics that you set it out for it to improve, then yeah, I mean it becomes, then your challenge becomes cultural, becomes around getting people to adopt and buy in and get the rest of the leaders to see the value in it. So, but at least you've proven it out in a space that is actually conducive versus bringing it to a store manager, and the store manager's, yeah, that worked in the warehouse behind the behind this head office, but it's, is it really going to work? How's that going to work here? I mean, I don't have, that's not my reality. screens get messy in my environment. I have kids with juice running around, spilling stuff all over, frying, these cool screens you sent me last time, or Wi-Fi is really is really spotty in this building, or all these things that, well, in the lab it wasn't like that. It was all working perfectly. Like, okay, well,
No, I think that's a key takeaway, like for our listeners, that if you're thinking about building an or using an innovation lab as a strategy to move forward, or you get yourself out of a certain situation, I absolutely agree with you. Location, location, location. Think about how you put the lab as close as possible to, your customers or where your customers are at.
right. Yeah, and I mean, I think there's the people factor is the key one there too. So that location is very much driven by the people you have in that location and their willingness to adopt to it. And that's something we've come around to, because I was again firmly in the other camp originally, thinking no, an innovation space needs to be almost like this. You remember innovation groups started from skunkworks, right? What were skunkworks? We were told that the only way innovation would start, Lockheed Martin had said we need to make sure this group doesn't come in contact at all with our regular people, because they're just going to get all the reasons why it won't work, while they won't be able to build the Blackbird. And that was sort of the doctrine of innovation. And in some spaces, I'm sure it is. The place where I'm struggling a bit, Yaniv, right now with the model that I'm sort of more interested in, this more realistic, reality-based model, is I still think there's really good innovation that comes out of cross-pollinizing industries or stakeholders. And that was one of the big motivations I had originally for the standalone sandbox. Was easier to pull in like a bunch of different people together that usually wouldn't interact, and sort of create that magic, the pixie dust. And I still like that premise. I still think there's a lot of the interesting innovation comes from the unexpected. And so there has to maybe be an opportunity, and maybe that's sort of a V2 of thinking, okay, how could we cross pollinate innovation? So if I'm working, let's say, in a convenience environment, who could I invite in here that would be sort of unusual in this environment, but that could probably create some interesting? Is it an automotive or a pharmaceutical, or is it a chemical, or something like very different that's not necessarily usually tied to this, to see what kind of ideas they come up with. But that won't happen, and that won't be happening in V1s. But I'm a fan of cross pollination when it comes to sort of generating innovative ideas. So that's the next challenge. How do you do that in a realistic environment? So
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanna before we wrap up, I wanna touch on like one last thing that you mentioned, kind of in passing, about the people in the trenches getting fired, those innovation managers, those innovation professionals. How do we help them get out of this situation? Or
yeah, well, I think that's more. I mean, I mean, the people I know, I don't know about you, but the people I know that are good in this space, I mean, they're never lacking. I mean, it's sort of part of the trajectory. And, in some cases, this is like a breathing space for them finally, because they've been on a mad dash up to this point. And there'll be opportunities to get into new endeavors again, but, fairly quickly. Um, I'll broaden it out beyond just the innovation. I mean, I think the interesting thing right now is, and I've been telling this especially to senior executives, there's been a lot of turnover in senior executive roles in retail for the last, especially like 2-3 years, as organizations sort of want fresh new thinking to come in. And I always encourage them to look sort of on the other side of the fence. So if you're a VP of merchandising, how could you go work for a technology company and help that technology company understand the merchandiser's needs? And that's sort of the vice versa too. Honestly, I think the innovation person's in a better place right now, where if the retailer or whatever wants to get a little more of that DNA in them, that they sort of fast iterative startup innovation / whatever buzzword, agile, everything else you want to use, mindset, then that innovation expert probably has a lot of opportunities to go in any organization, right now, from banking to manufacturing to, in all sorts of directions. The one place, if they do have time and they want to shore up some specific skills, I really think that, this is not new, but and even maybe sounds old at this stage, but anything to do around making sure that their data skills are top notch, that they understand, and especially the shortfalls and the blind spots of data, and if they can become experts at recognizing that and then applying it within this. Again, I'll say it, the privacy paradox is understanding what those rules are, how that's moving. I think they will serve organizations really well if they come in and say, I know how to, I have a track record of helping organizations innovate, but I also understand the shortcomings of them and where where especially the data falls short.
Before we wrap up, if people want to learn more about you, what you do, maybe get in touch, what's the best way to do that?
I always like LinkedIn. I mean, I'm pretty easy to find. Carl Boutet, Carl with a C, Boutet on LinkedIn. And if not, I'm pretty much in every other social platform, but that's the one I encourage people to reach out to me on. And yeah, I mean, you can find me tied to the McGill work. And also I took on a new responsibility just recently, managing our Quebec, or the province I live in Canada's commercial innovation center too. So there's be a lot of places to find me.
Nice, nice. That's great. So I will link your LinkedIn profile in the show
There we
notes.
go. Now that's innovation.
That's innovation. Thank you so much, Carl, for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Yaniv. So I really enjoyed it.